Alright guys, how's it going? Welcome back. Today I'm in this second generation BMW 1 Series. You know, last night I was checking through all my videos, all 280 of them, and I realised I'd never filmed with the BMW 1 Series, apart from the M140i. So I thought it was about time that I featured one on the channel. There is a good reason I've avoided them all this time though. I just don't think they're very good. The first 1 Series, the E81, was released back in 2004, and I was never a big fan. I always thought they were a bland looking car that resembled a bread van, and they weren't particularly reliable, and unless you went for the 6-cylinder in the 130, they weren't that fast or entertaining either. Then in 2011 they released the second generation, known as the F20, like the one I'm in today. This model ran all the way until 2019. I think the 1 Series is one of those cars that people buy only because of the badge, which is understandable because it doesn't have an awful lot else going for it. People always say, well, it's rear-wheel drive, it's a proper driver's car. Well, that might be the case if you go for one of the M Sport models with a proper engine under the bonnet, but most don't. Most are either diesel, or they've got the unreliable little engine from a Mini, which is about as powerful as the Andorran Army. I just don't really see the point. You'd be better off with a Kia Proceed, or a Ford Focus, or a Golf, or an Audi A3, or a Lexus CT200, or an A-Class. Anyway, let's get on to the review. Firstly then, let's talk about its looks. Styling's subjective, isn't it? But I didn't think the first generation was a very good looking car. This second generation does look a little bit better, so long as you go for a sport model or an M Sport. This generation's curvier than its predecessor, and the lines are softer. It just looks nicer in my opinion. They offer it as a 3-door or a 5-door, and the doors on the 3-door are pillarless, which is quite cool. The 3-door models look sporty, but you do lose some practicality. I don't think the F20 is a bad looking car. From the side it looks alright, the rear's quite nice. It's just the front that's a little bit gormless. Moving inside, it's all quite bland really. Quite uninspiring. You've got this fixed screen here which doesn't go anywhere, and that's controlled by this iDrive system here, which is nice and easy to operate. And I do quite like the brushed aluminium. And you've got 2 cup holders and some storage here, more storage in the door cards, a decent sized glove compartment, some storage under this centre armrest. It's all quite practical, it's just a little bit dull. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, it's all perfectly usable. It just isn't very memorable. You know, if you compare this to the interior on the new A-Class or the Audi A3, they're just much nicer places to be. If you're in the market for one, make sure you go for a nicely spec'd model with all the toys. Most aren't. Most are about as luxurious as a phone box. It isn't all negative though. The climate control is nice and easy to use, as is the stereo, and the stereo quality is very good. You can stream your music via Bluetooth, and everything's nice and easy to figure out. In terms of interior space, there's plenty up front. Plenty of legroom, plenty of headroom, plenty of elbow room, so there aren't any complaints on that front. The back, however, doesn't fare quite as well. One little annoying gripe is the position of the footrest. They've placed it too close to the clutch. 2 or 3 times this morning I've found myself catching that by accident when changing gear. So yeah, the rear space isn't the best. I think even your children won't find it very comfortable back there. Moving on to the boot, that isn't too bad at 360 litres. It's about the same size as a Golf. And the rear seats fold flat, which extends that space to about 1200 litres. So I think most people would find this quite easy to live with, if you're mainly going to use the front 2 seats. It also rides quite nicely. It isn't too firm or stiff. It's perfectly comfortable. Now, because this is a BMW, you'd expect this to be a blast to drive, wouldn't you? Well, it isn't really. It's a bit vanilla, a bit Magnolia. It lacks any real flavour. It's front-engined, rear-wheel drive, and I've got a manual gearbox, so all the ingredients are there, but it just doesn't really put a smile on your face. I can appreciate the handling and the steering because they're both excellent, but the engines just lack any real punch, so you never really have much fun in it. This is the 118i, which uses a 1.6 litre 4-cylinder petrol engine, and it produces around 170 horsepower. It does feel peppier than the 116 or the 114, but it's still about 30 or 40 horses short of being fun. On the bright side though, it'll do about 35 miles per gallon around town, and early 50s on a steady motorway run, so it isn't too thirsty. If you go for a diesel model, they're good for about 70 miles per gallon. My criticisms here don't really matter, I suppose, in the grand scheme of things, because they're a really popular car. You see lots of them on the road. But for me, I just think a BMW should have a big 6-cylinder engine. Same with Mercedes. Without a big powerful engine, they're almost not worthy of the badge. I overheard an elderly neighbour of mine recently talking about a new car, and she said, well, we've had all the big BMs and Mercedes and all that stuff. And I thought, well, you haven't really. You've had a C180 compressor. That isn't a big Mercedes. It's the same with this. I think if you've only ever had a 318i or a 116, you don't really know what BMW's all about. I know there's a huge gulf in price and running costs, but this thing doesn't feel remotely related to the M140i. That felt alive. This feels lethargic. Also, the manual gearbox isn't a joy to drive like it is in most BMWs. And the reverse gear annoys me. You've got to really whack it over to the left, so much so that you almost dislocate your shoulder. There are various trim levels available. It starts with the SE, then the Sport, like this model, then the M Sport. The sportier M Sport models do have a slightly firmer ride, so I'd probably pick something like a Sport, to be honest. The F20 had a facelift in 2015, so it got a slightly nicer interior, slightly better styling, and some different engines. They replaced a lot of the 4-cylinder engines with turbocharged 3s. When you start to get a move on these country roads, it does handle very well, but you almost feel like you're wringing its neck. Whereas had it been fitted with a 6-cylinder, it'd barely break a sweat. One of my biggest gripes with the 1 Series is reliability. I've had loads of issues with them over the years. I sold one of these a few years ago to my brother's girlfriend at the time, and she had nothing but issues with it. I did warn her at the time not to buy a BMW 1 Series, but she didn't listen. I guess, as many people do, she was just drawn by the badge. I remember suggesting she get something like a Kia Proceed instead, but she wasn't interested. Now that was a 7 or 8-year-old 1 Series with about 60,000 miles on the clock, and when I bought it, the service history was okay. It had missed a couple of services here or there, as most of them do, because most people that buy these can't really afford to run them. Again, they've mainly bought by younger people who just are drawn to them because of the badge. When I picked it up, it had a drivetrain fault light on the dash, so I took it to my local BMW specialist, Darren Wood, who put new timing chain tensioners on it. That cost me about £1,000. Showed it for about 4 or 5 months, way out of its warranty period, and the gearbox broke, so I had to pay for a gearbox rebuild, which cost me the best part of £3,000. I paid for it because it was kind of family and I couldn't be bothered with the grief. I know that kind of thing can happen with any used car, but it really shouldn't happen with a German car with only 60,000 miles on the clock. It shouldn't be on its second gearbox, should it? Take this one for example. This one's done 43,000 miles, it's a 2014, and it's absolutely immaculate. I'm not just saying this because it's for sale, but it is the nicest 1 Series I've ever bought. It's been looked after properly, it's got full BMW service history, and it was in this condition when I bought it. It's a very, very clean car, this. But when I was checking through the service history, this is its second gearbox. It was replaced at about 30,000 miles. German cars are perceived to be sturdy and well engineered. Well, in the case of the 1 Series, I can categorically say that that isn't the case. Trying to find a nice one on the used market is a bit of a minefield because they're mainly bought by younger people who just don't have the money to look after them properly. They'd rather spend the money on a new pair of Balenciagas than a brake fluid service. Therefore, you've got to try and buy one from somebody who's sensible. Somebody who's looked after it. Somebody who bought it because of its size rather than just its badge. If you opt for a 2-litre diesel, which is probably the pick of the bunch, you could have issues with the turbo, the timing chain, the gearbox, the EGR valve, the DPF. One piece of advice, by the way, if you have to replace the EGR valve at any point, don't use a spurious one. Make sure it's an authentic BMW part. Unfortunately, I've learnt that the hard way. Used prices here in the UK start at around £5,000 or £6,000, but I would avoid those ones because it will cause you nothing but heartache. You'll have to spend around 9 or 10 to get yourself a decent one. You need to make sure it's the right spec, make sure it's the right sellable colour, and make sure it's got good service history. But to be honest, I think you'd be better off with a Mercedes A-Class or an A3 instead. Or if you want reliability and economy, something like a Lexus CT. So there we go then, the F20 1 Series. I've not really sold this one to you, have I? But as always, I think it's better to share my honest experiences with you rather than big something up that just doesn't deserve the credit. So thank you once again for watching. Make sure you give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't done already. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'll leave the link below. If you've got any comments or questions, let me know below and I'll do my best to get back to you. If you're interested in getting into the used car business, then check out my online course. I've created an online portal with nearly 100 videos which explain every single aspect of the used motor trade. How to start, funding options, branding, sourcing cars, it's all there, so do check it out. And it's still free for the first 30 days, so I'll leave the link below in the video description. So yeah, cheers guys, I'll see you next time.